right, I am super excited to be here with Matt Gowie today. We have got a lot in common with our friend Infrastructure as Code, so this is going to be a fantastic conversation. Matt, thanks so much for joining me here today. Can you tell folks who you are and what you do?
Yeah, my name is Matt. I run an infrastructure as code consulting firm called MasterPoint. We help our clients really build efficient, scalable platforms with infrastructure as code, primarily Terraform and Open Tofu, building in sustainable patterns and practices so that they don't need to have infrastructure as code be so painful and not be something that holds them back from shipping infrastructure and getting their application teams unblocked. So that's what we do well. Yeah.
I love it. It's one of those big things. I think it's easily talked about. Oh, just create some infrastructure as code to do that thing. But that sounds great for one, two, or even five services. But when you start to get into complex applications, it can pretty quickly get daunting, especially for those that have never done it before and are provisioning a lot of their resources, sort of by hand. So that's amazing. Now, when I've been asking most folks this, when you hear the term platform engineer or platform engineering, what does that mean to you and in the circles that you run in?
Yeah. I hope we're not destroying the term like it is with DevOps. And I feel like I'm interested to hear, through this podcast, all the different answers that you get, because the way I view it now and the way somebody else views it, it's easy for us to be off by a few inches and kind of get it different. But the way I view it is really, hey, platform engineers are a role, and doing platform engineering, you're building a platform, and that platform is to service the application engineers who are building the product, building the actual thing that you're selling, or even if you're giving it away. They're the ones who are writing code that is the APIs, the front end UI, or whatever it is. And you're, as a platform engineer and in the realm of platform engineering, shipping that, helping them get it deployed, monitor it, really tune it so that it's being performant. It is not going to go down, so that it's reliable, so that it's secure. And that's what I think of as platform engineering. And I hope that that's the better view than the word DevOps, which is, we have five different, different we have five different ways of really describing what DevOps is now. And some people think it's a title, some people think it's a culture, some people think it's a way of, it's what application engineers should do. So I think that there's a lot of better ways of thinking about things now that we have platform engineering as a term and as a thing that's come into our industry.
Yeah, I think it's a lot more solidified. The DevOps one still sort of triggers me a little bit. Having been a DevOps engineer, for lack of a better term, for a number of years, and it's one of those interesting things because I think with platform engineering there is some definition to it and what we're trying to achieve. One of the interesting things around DevOps was that it's a way of working. It's dev and ops combining together, not necessarily team changes or positions or anything like that. And for me, that led to the knowing that you as an organization, you could practice DevOps, without necessarily having people who were in a DevOps team or DevOps engineers. Do you find that's the same with platform engineering? Because I know there are, certainly in medium to large organizations, there are platform engineers and there are platform teams whose responsibility is to maintain and manage and build these platforms. But for smaller organizations, can they still practice platform engineering without necessarily having platform engineers?
I think so. I think that it doesn't necessarily. I think it's a broad enough term that we can say you're building a platform, even if you call your engineers DevOps engineers. And that platform is really the thing. You're creating a service for your internal application teams and your application engineers. And I think that's really what platform engineering comes down to. So you might not say you have a platform engineering team. You might not say you have platform engineers, but if you're building a platform, if you're creating the infrastructure, the monitoring and observability, the security guardrails, all these different things that go into shipping software, whether that's on the cloud or on-prem, I think that you are practicing platform engineering to one degree or another, and there's a platform in play. And that's what I think of as platform engineering.
Yeah, gotcha. Cool. Now, you mentioned sort of in the intro, there was a lot that you do around Terraform and Open Tofu with the consulting and services that you guys provide. I want to get into a bit of a tooling discussion with you. And there are a lot of tools in the infrastructure as code space. For better or worse, not sure. I got introduced to infrastructure as code with ARM templates, as in like the JSON ARM templates.
I was
And
there. I did that once upon a time too.
yeah, condolences. Yeah, I think
Yeah.
we've both got the scars somewhere to show that we've been through that one. And then Bicep came along in the Azure world, and that was, I sort of gravitated towards that. And at the same time, the company I was working with, we were doing a lot of Terraform as well. So that's been a lot of my exposure. But I know that other cloud providers have their own tooling as well, like AWS. And then we talk about other tools like Pulumi, and there's Crossplane as well, which is based around having Kubernetes and writing them as Kubernetes manifest files. And so I wouldn't call it a messy ecosystem, but there's a lot of tools in this space. So I'd like to unpack both, I guess, your opinion and also what you see in the field when you work with maybe a new customer. Do you work with customers who haven't yet selected a tool, and that's part of the conversation that you need to go through? And how does that look?
I think a lot of the times we have clients who know where they're going. Like they either have figured out, hey, we really want to be on Terraform or Open Tofu. It doesn't really matter to them. I think a lot of people are picking Open Tofu today, but maybe they have some legacy cloud formation or something along those lines. They have, ARM templates, but they realize, hey, this wasn't working for us. And I could get into why the vendor solutions, ARM templates and cloud formation and Bicep, like those are holistically, I would never recommend a customer or a client, utilize those tools just because they're only for that cloud. And then that pigeonholes you into, hey, now we want to go and automate another provider. We want to go and automate Datadog, or we want to automate GitHub, or we want to automate Sentry, or whatever it is. And if you are using CloudFormation or you're using Bicep, you are stuck on only automating your cloud resources with the hyperscaler, with the cloud you've chosen. And that's not a good position to be in. You're kind of stuck. So anyway, to get back to your question, our clients come to us and they have, a goal in mind, and they're trying to, adopt and kind of figure out, hey, we want to really rally around one tool. Sometimes they have that tool already and they have a small amount, a small scope. Mm-hmm. Other times they have 4 other tools in their tool set today, and they've really gotten spread across the infrastructure as code landscape. And they're saying to us, hey, should we keep these other ones around? And our, answer to that is always no. You should consolidate. You should really find a way to push all of your expertise into one thing, use that one tool really well, and create good practices around that one tool. Because if you go for all of them, you go for more than one, you're really going to create some negative practices and cruft for yourself within your organization. There's just no getting around that.
Yeah, it's kind of like, I view it as a little bit like multi-cloud, and a lot of people talk about, compute and network in Azure is compute and network in AWS as it is in, insert cloud provider. And while that's true, there are all these nuances when you start to get into implementing those things that you start to need to have some expertise in that domain of exactly how virtual networks work in Azure, and then network security groups and subnets and routing and all of those specifics. Like conceptually, sure, a network's a network, and similarly in AWS. But and I think that's where, if you stay broad and try and conceptualize it across the different clouds, then you can't go as deep into those tools, and you probably won't get the full benefits out of those tools either. by not going deep into them. And I found the same. So when I was doing Bicep, they had variables, and then I came across, and then I was working, I'd switch across to work with Terraform, which also has variables, but they're kind of like parameters. Variables in Terraform are more like parameters in Bicep. So, and just that mental model of trying to switch between the tools, and remember to try and do things well, is just a really difficult thing when you're working with multiple tools, I find anyway.
Yeah, it's hard to create standard practices across diverse tooling, and like all of these tools that we're talking about, they were built in a vacuum. They weren't like built so that you could play really well together. Yes, AWS, like I really like your cloud analogy, by the way, but so I'm going to use that. But AWS and Azure both have VPC constructs, but or a better example is they both have a managed database construct, or a managed Kubernetes construct is a better one.
Mm-hmm.
But the way that they've implemented IAM, like identity and access management, and how you utilize those tools so that you can get a user or a role to be authenticated within that cluster or authenticated within your cloud environment, is going to be so different that it's really, you're not talking apples to apples. It's apples and oranges. They both are like circular, but you need to deal with them differently. And that's the same with infrastructure as code. And you really can't approach it as if you're going to be able to create a solid, sustainable way of approaching, like handling everything, if you have multiple tools in the kitchen essentially.
Yeah. And I've got one like really simple example of what you mentioned around Terraform, obviously being, reasonably tool agnostic, not just cloud agnostic, but you mentioned a few tools that you might want to tap into. And I remember one of the first times I was building some infrastructure as code, it was in either ARM templates or Bicep. It was probably ARM templates. And they were the customer was all in Azure, so it was kind of fine. It was relatively straightforward web app database application, with a few other storage accounts and little things. So it wasn't overly complex. But then they said to me, "Oh, we manage all of our DNS and our ingress comes in through Cloudflare." I'm like, "Okay, that's cool." And then I suddenly realized that I'd built like a pipeline to go and deploy this infrastructure as code, and it was all, nested modules and that sort of thing. But like halfway through the deployment where I deployed the web app, I needed to register a new domain name for the environment that was being spun up.
Yeah.
And I hit this brick wall, and I was like, okay, so now I either need to break my deployment pipeline into two parts, like part A, and then have a script in the pipeline that goes and calls Cloudflare's APIs, does the thing, and then part B can continue. Or what I ended up doing, which was still kind of the same thing, was in Azure, you could, I forget the actual resource, but you could run a script in one of their resources, and you could define that in infrastructure as code. It certainly wasn't elegant. It was the same thing conceptually. The deployment did, X amount, and then this script ran, and then the rest of it continued. But from my pipeline, it looked like I could go and deploy, the one module or the one piece of infrastructure as code. So I think that even if you are in, like you said, if you're in one environment or cloud provider or private cloud or whatever it is, I think you will quickly find there's these other little things, or not even little, there's other things that you want to integrate with. So yeah, Terraform or Open Tofu can really make a lot of sense.
Yeah, there's going to be something else that you want to integrate with one day, and the vendor solutions, CloudFormation, Bicep, they are a single tool that does one thing, which is manage that resource, and you can hack around as much as you want, but you're only going to create technical debt for yourself, something that somebody is going to find is not easy to understand, isn't easily documented. It is going to look ugly and feel ugly to other people that come after you if you are just using those vendor solutions. And I think even if it's Pulumi, I mean, Open Tofu, Terraform, Pulumi, they all give you more of a Swiss Army knife than a single tool that does one thing.
Yeah. And this is truly for my own understanding here, because I know that there was Terraform, and then there was all the stuff around Terraform, the license change, and then Open Tofu formed out of that. And I kind of followed it at the time. I know we both know Ned Bellavance. He had a lot of thoughts on it at the time. I do follow a lot of Ned stuff, so I naturally saw a lot of it when it was, big news and a hot topic for discussion.
Yep.
Admittedly, I haven't really followed on, especially in, I guess, the last 6 to 12 months, especially, I guess, acquisition by IBM of HashiCorp. And I genuinely haven't followed that through to now. So what does that look like now? And when are folks picking one over the other? Or is it that sort of decision? And how does that surface?
Yeah, it's interesting now because there's some new stuff that Terraform actually just released 2 new features to Terraform at their conference at HashiConf a month or so ago, just recently, that are interesting. I don't think they're groundbreaking for me in terms of like they're not going to cause me or my organization to switch. We're big fans of Open Tofu and big fans of open source generally. But I would say if folks are building new, I don't know many that are picking Terraform deliberately. Maybe they're picking Terraform because they don't know that there's an alternative. They don't know about the drawbacks that you have with Terraform. But for the people who are doing their research, the Open Tofu team has really done a fantastic job of proving themselves. They've built some really awesome new differentiating functionality that I think
Okay.
is really valuable. Dynamic backends is, encrypted state. There's a number of things that they've done that are really cool, and then they've also just been really good within the community. So I would say for people who are not that don't have a huge corpus of Terraform code, the people who are starting new are really likely, from my experience, gravitating towards Open Tofu. And even for those that do have a big amount of Terraform, we've seen, I believe it's Fidelity had 4,000 root modules. Maybe it was more. I don't know. There's a big enterprise who made a huge switch to Open Tofu
Okay.
because you have no optionality in terms of how you automate Terraform, right? You have to go with Terraform Cloud unless you want to build it yourself. And I can talk about building it yourself later. But if you want to automate Terraform well, like having the rich ecosystem of good vendors that Open Tofu supports is really nice. And then they are, a fantastic project. So they're doing really well. Yeah, I think that's the synopsis version. It's been an interesting time. It's one thing that's cool is that I think it's garnered some competition where we're seeing the Terraform ecosystem, the Terraform maintainers try a bit harder because they now have competition, and I think they've been sitting on, hey, we're the only tool in this space, we have the market share, we don't really need to move. And now they're trying to change things, which I really love, because now hopefully we end up with 2 awesome tools that are competing and they both do really well. I'm going to continue to pick the open source one just because there's, in my mind, not a reason to go with the vendor locked solution, but people can make their own choice. So it's cool.
Yeah, cool. And for those that might not have heard of Open Tofu before, like it's from a language perspective, it's the same thing, right? So if you learn Terraform, you've learned what Open Tofu is using. It's all the same concepts and language and everything like that. Is that right?
Yeah, and this is one of the things I think that's really scared people is they didn't really understand, hey, how big is this migration to Open Tofu? Really, what goes into it? Why would we switch if this is, heavyweight? And it's exactly the same thing. It is, Open Tofu is a direct fork of Terraform at Terraform 1.5.7, and it is completely compatible. The only thing that we're starting to see divergences on is where Open Tofu or Terraform implement a new set of functionality that the other does not yet support. So if you use ephemeral values in Terraform, I believe it's 1.10, and you are using that in 1.10 of Terraform and you plan to switch to Open Tofu, Open Tofu hasn't come out with ephemeral values yet. It's in progress. It'll probably be out within the coming next major version or two. Not major version, minor version. Got to talk about Semver correctly. But that is a thing that will potentially break when you migrate. But if if you've been on Terraform 1.5 for a year past the BSL change, the business source license change, then you would have a migration that's super simple. We've migrated hundreds of thousands of lines of Terraform code to Open Tofu at this point for sure.
Okay.
And I feel very confident that it's really easy. It's exactly compatible. It's really, people shouldn't be worried about it. So I think it's compatible. Yeah.
Yeah. That's comforting to hear. I think especially if you hadn't dug too deep into that, I think it can be easily turned off because like you said, you immediately think, oh, this is a migration, that's unplanned work. What's that going to mean for all of our modules and all of our Terraform code that we've written? So you said something there in that, well, you said a few things in that conversation I'm going to come back to, but one of the things that you said is that you tend to pick open source, most of the time sort of by default and which is what led to Open Tofu. And I think this one's big for platform teams because I read a post of yours recently, and I'm going to quote the first line out of it in a minute, which will sort of start the conversation. This is a little bit around building your own infrastructure as code or using open source modules or registries or repositories that are out there. And the start of the post said, if your platform team is still writing every Terraform and Open Tofu resource by hand, you're falling behind. So that's a pretty bold statement, but I think that there's a lot of meaning behind that. And of course, I'll link the posts in the show notes as well and any other resources that we talk about, because it's a fantastic post that unpacks a lot of different angles of this. And I'd love to talk through that with you now.
Yeah. This is a fun one just because I feel like it's very divisive. I feel like our community, that the infrastructure as code ecosystem is very split on whether to use open source or just build it their own, use open source as a set of inspiration to build their own. And we're big fans of using open source. We contribute, help maintain, and build our own open source all the time in terms of infrastructure as code modules. We're huge supporters of the Cloud Posse module ecosystem. I think a lot of people have a bad connection to open source infrastructure modules because they've gone and run into the kitchen sink module. And it really happens often where you have a child module that maybe it's managing a VPC, and it slowly over years grows to have 400, 500 variables. And now it manages so much within the realm of what is a VPC that it's really hard to understand. And that's an example of bad open source, right? It is, it's something that you have to kind of fight against within the open source ecosystem when you're maintaining. But if you keep a module small and opinionated and say, hey, it does this one thing and it does this one thing really well, open source modules can really be a great way to think about how you build your infrastructure, because you can take all these small open source blocks and you can slowly build your house, your pyramid, however you want to think about your larger ecosystem of infrastructure. And that is what we do. And we've used this with 24 clients, probably, a dozen plus, somewhere in that realm, where we really successfully set them up for not having to maintain hundreds of thousands of lines of Terraform. And instead they can rely on the open source community to provide security updates, to launch new features as they, become available, to provide better potential bug fixes that they don't even know about. And then those are not something that the developers that are consuming those open source modules need to think about. They're a version bump away. And that ends up being a really powerful thing when you're running infrastructure at scale beyond one person. I think that we've seen a lot of shops, a lot of clients who have built all of their own open source modules, and maybe the person who built them left and they had put in a bunch of bad practices, and they really ended up reinventing the wheel. I love that term.
Mm.
They reinvented the wheel in a way that the wheel's now crooked, and now the team who's responsible for that wheel really needs to like spend time and effort to continually shape that wheel back into something that's actually round and usable. And that's the frustrating thing, is when you build it your own, you really have the chance to shoot yourself in the foot. And that's what we try and avoid. So yeah, big proponent of open source. I think that there's a lot of people who go another way, and I don't necessarily blame them, but it's an interesting discussion within this industry for sure.
Yeah, yeah. One thing that I heard and saw and still see a lot in the field is people thinking that their environment is unique and different and, bespoke. But I'd love to get your opinion on this. Like, at the end of the day, a database is a database, right? And a
Yeah.
load balancer is a load balancer. Like, you might have nuanced things within that, but that's where the flexibility of these modules allows you to customize it for your requirements. Is that fair?
Yeah, I love that thought process, because I bring that up a lot to people when I talk about this. It's, what do you think? Do you think your competitors' infrastructure is different than yours? Like, do you think that you are building something special if you're creating a new child module or a new root module for managing an RDS database? Like, why do you think it's special? And do you have the hubris to think that you're going to get all of the security settings right? Or would you rather rely on the open source community, who's likely going to be able to provide at least all the knobs and dials so that you can get those security things completely tuned, so that you can pass that audit and you don't need to think as hard, and you don't need to go and make 20 different changes to get there? And yeah, it comes down to, like, if you're building everything yourself, you're reinventing that wheel. Your competitors probably are not, because they don't think that they're building something, that is unique, and therefore you're going slower than them. So now your application teams are going to be waiting on you, while your competitors might not be, because they might be using open source. And I think that's like a good way of framing it that might get it into people's heads that, hey, we're not shipping, like, a lot of this isn't rocket science. We're like
Mm.
connecting all these various components, but a lot of it should be really look a lot the same. So yeah, it's a good point.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
That's, I mean, I've used a few of the modules or the repositories that we're sort of referring to here, and I think any day of the week I would rather use something that's collaborative like that, and you kind of then get some breadth from different people in the industry, right? Like, you get folks who are more versed in security contributing to the project with, these should be the default security settings for this resource, and you get other folks who are maybe have a development background and know, oh, we should set up the infrastructure this way by default, and you get this collaboration that you just don't really get working in isolation within, by yourself or within your own company. Like, you might get that to a smaller extent, but you can really use that power of the community, I find, by using these modules. And then hopefully, if you're a company who's using these modules, hopefully your leadership gives you a little bit of time to also give back as well, right? So if you use one of them and you notice that it's not quite working right, or it's got a bug, or there's a new feature that hasn't been added into the modules yet, hopefully you've got that flexibility to submit that pull request back and help contribute as well, right?
Yeah. And that's, I don't know, when I started contributing and heavily using open source, it was because of Terraform. And it's really, I would say it was definitely one of the things that really enabled me to learn a lot of good practices, and to really feel like this ecosystem is a community, and I can rely on and talk with other people within that community, uh, to learn to grow and build the right architecture. And I think that maybe not everybody will find that that's a little rosy, tinted glasses, but uh, I think that there's a lot to be said about that contributing back, and what that can gain for you as an engineer, and what it can mean for helping build a better ecosystem that we all like really benefit and do well for ourselves on. It's it's important. It's a good thing that we have going. So I would
Mm.
tell people to take advantage of it. And yeah, I think I could talk about it for a while. So I'll stop there.
Future episode where I get you back and we can do a deep dive on it maybe.
Yeah.
Are there instances that you come across with customers where you sort of talk through a lot of this and they just get to the point of saying, understand what you're saying about the open source, available modules, but we just can't? Like, are there any actual reasons that customers you work with have for saying we need to build this ourselves?
No, what's funny is that I've definitely run into those voices on Reddit, on LinkedIn. I've never run into them with a client, and I think it's that the people that do it who are on the internet, the people who are advocating against open source, they've gotten burned, and they've gotten
Mm.
burned because the complexity was too high, or they really just felt like, hey, I can do this better, and they they ended up going the different path, and it worked out for them in their use case, and they don't really understand the things that they're leaving behind by not using open source. They think that the amount of maintenance that they're doing is acceptable, and it probably isn't, but nobody's calling them out on it, so it's okay. And I think I can like empathize with them and understand and say, hey, that's reasonable for the situation you got yourself in. Maybe you picked up the VPC module that has the 500 inputs, and you sat scratching your head against it for multiple days, and you said, this isn't worth it, let me just go and figure this out on my own. I can I can't say that, hey, if I was in that situation, that wouldn't frustrate me as well. But I think that once you learn to adopt and consume it, you're good. And whenever we've brought that to clients, whenever we've said, hey, this is our way of doing things to clients, we've never gotten pushback, because they trust us to make the good decisions. They know that we have experience doing this. We have done this many times across many projects, and it's worked out for a number of organizations. So they really end up getting on board with our line of thinking pretty quickly. And I don't even really think it's ever been all that contentious, honestly. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's interesting.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, and it's you brought up something there that was like, if you get burned once, you're not very likely to come back and reevaluate, even years later, right? Which is, I've come across folks that I've worked with many years ago who got burned by something 5 years previous to that, and they tried to do something and it didn't work. And me as like a young, early 20s engineer coming in, and I was like, oh, but it's not like that anymore. The company's
Yeah.
updated their tooling, or there's new features, and some people just didn't want a bar of it, right? Because they'd felt that pain. They, like you said, they'd got the burns. They don't want to go back for a second round. But I think one of the strengths that we can have in IT, just as general, with whatever part of IT that you're in, is sort of doing that reevaluation and being open to it, and trying to have a holistic view that, okay, I tried that thing before. Have things evolved and changed? Things in our space move so quickly, right?
Yeah, and I think there's a good analogy to the folks who are saying AI will never be like valuable and it just hallucinates. It's like, yes, it does hallucinate, and it can burn you, and you can get things wrong, and you can get bad code, but that does not mean it's not a useful tool. Like, that does not mean that just because you got burned that one time, that you shouldn't continue to work with it until you have it being a valuable contribution to your output, because it can be extremely valuable. And if you just let it hallucinate that one time and flip the
Mm.
table and said, no, I'm not going to keep using this thing, that's not, you're really going to fall behind, because the rest of us are just continuing to work with it and figure it out and use it for a lot of speed and optimization. So it's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And how are you seeing that impact AI specifically? How are you seeing that impact the infrastructure as code world, both from customers you're working with, what you're doing yourselves, and sort of seeing in those open source communities?
Yeah. I think that it is increasing speed On my team, we're using it to really, we'll take on a project, we'll scope a project, and we, like any engineering team, will get scope wrong, or client didn't tell us about X, Y, and Z that's in their infrastructure when we initially talked to them. So, and it's on me. I probably did a bad job scoping the project, but we'll find a bunch of stuff, right? And usually that would require that we have to expand our timeline and go to the customer and say, hey, we're going to take a little bit longer because of these things that got added to scope. And one of the things that I've really noticed recently is that that's happened multiple times where scope has increased, but we've just adopted that and kept moving and still finished the project exactly on time, even finished a lot more that was in our original scope, because we can get to that thing that we saw that was like, oh, that looks like a dumpster fire over there. We want to fix that, but we don't really have time. Let's hold off. Oh, we do have time,
Mm.
because our speed to develop what we're trying to do is a good bit faster. So yeah, let's go and fix that dumpster fire. Let's go and write that, documentation on how the client should think about that so that they can avoid a dumpster fire like that again in the future. And it's, at least in my immediate team, we have 8 engineers at MasterPoint. Uh, we're we're seeing it really speed things up. The On infrastructure as code specifically, I think we've seen a lot of skepticism from the platform DevOps, engineering community. And I think that it's because it doesn't do as good of a job as it does with traditional application engineering languages. It's just not as trained as well yet.
Hmm.
And I think it's getting better. But that just means you need better prompts. That means you need to give it the right context. That just means you need to hook it up to the Open Tofu MCP or something along those lines, so that there are ways to make it work really well for you. And I think you just need to know the tricks. We have one blog post that's about how to generate really good Open Tofu tests using AI. And we use that on all of our modules. We use that on a bunch of client code.
Hmm.
It's a speed amplifier, no question. So yeah, I'm seeing it have a big impact. And there's a whole other discussion there in terms of what people think the future of infrastructure will be with AI. And that's different than what's the current state of infrastructure as code plus AI. But there's definitely benefits happening today with AI and infrastructure as code.
Yeah, it's I I think you hit the nail on something there specifically, which is pretty well known. I think now is that context is king for AI and these large language models when you're trying to do something specific. So with the introduction of things like MCP and Claude Code, where you can actually put it in the repository that you're working in, so it's got context of the rest of the files. You're not just in a like one chat GPT interface copy and pasting some Terraform code. I think that's where it really comes through. But I think that's also as with anything to do with AI, it's important to have that human touch and that human expertise, right? Like at the end of the day, you and your team of engineers are the ones that are reading what comes out of this, and they're able to quickly spot, oh, that's excellent. We can use that, or that's great. I still need to tweak these few things because of, things that it got wrong or could be improved. So yeah, I think that's really important to keep in mind as well.
Yeah. And there's definitely something to, there's so many of these like new early AI driven startups that are building. They probably have an engineer who knows, just enough Terraform that they can like hit, they can get apply to happen. And they're like, oh, now I built my application with AI, and now I even built my infrastructure as code with AI. And this is amazing. Now I'll be able to, do great things. But if that engineer doesn't know what's actually going on under the covers with that code, with that IaC code, and with the security settings, like if they're just making all their services They might make their database public because they ran into an issue and they were like, I can't connect to it.
Mm-hmm.
Can you fix this? And now their database is in a public subnet, and suddenly somebody's easily able to hack their bad password and, holds them for ransom. I worry about the folks who are doing that sort of thing. I think that that's going to start to come up more with AI generated code, because that's just inevitable. Like you're asking one person to do more things. They're going to have more gaps. They're not going to have the expertise to spot that huge security hole that some script kiddie kid is going to be able to find. And yeah, it's an inevitability in terms of the way things are moving, where people want their products to be as fast to market as possible, but they still want to try and do things right. Infrastructure as code is the right way to do things, but you do need to understand the underlying cloud, the underlying implications of what you're building.
Yeah, yep. The unfortunate overconfidence of AI and being like, sure, I can do that for you. Like you said, let's put it on a public subnet and open it up to the world. So yeah. You mentioned something in the conversation that I just want to touch on as we start to round out here, which was around using vendor tooling versus building it yourself. And we've kind of touched on that a little bit with like open source modules, and you build those internally yourselves. But where else are you seeing that conversation come up, and how do you see it play out, I guess, specifically in the infrastructure as code world, but also broadly as well? Yeah.
Yeah, this is another one of those super common pitfalls that we see clients run into. So that if they have some infrastructure as code, they might have written Jenkins pipelines or GitHub action pipelines around that code, because they thought, hey, why is this different than my application code? Why can't I just write a pipeline that makes it apply? And sadly, and I think a lot of people don't want to agree with this, but infrastructure as code from an operational perspective is, even though it's just give me a plan, I'll review it, and then you apply, it gets complicated because there's if you're doing infrastructure as code at any scale that doesn't fall over quickly, then you need to have many root modules. You need to have a set of, various sets of code that you end up applying, and each has their own state file. And then you also need to have security checks. You need some level of policy. You need some level of, that's the dev environment. Let that auto deploy. The prod environment, though, I really want to make sure that the security team confirms that these changes look good. So there's all these complexities in building it yourself. And when we see clients who have done that, they're either ignoring them or they're going so much slower than they really think they are. Like they're building their own pipelines and they're adding functionality to that, and they're sending one engineer to go and build their own GitHub action pipelines for all this infrastructure code that they have. And it's burning a hole in their pocket, essentially, because that engineer who's writing these pipelines all the time or feeding these, maintaining them, they are, again, they're reinventing the wheel, right? Like they're just building a worse wheel. And so we are big fans of the various vendors that are out there. Even if you're going to go and use Terraform Cloud, that's better than building your own thing. I think Terraform Cloud's pricing is outrageous. Another topic I probably shouldn't have brought up. A friend from Hashy is going to end up like, why you got to hit on it every time? But there's, a lot of good tooling out there. Even if you want to go the open source route, there is Atlantis, there is the folks at Terra Team. They have like a light version of their product that's open source. It's written in OCaml. I think I'll always give those guys a little bit of flack for writing their tool in OCaml. But there's, we're partnered with Spacelift. We really love that product. It has OPA wired everywhere in there. And it really, every time we roll it out to a client, we end up getting to the point where they're just like, oh, this is really amazing. Like we are really shipping things quickly. We have the full control that we need. And now it's moving like fast. And
Mm.
uh, there's plenty of good vendors out there. So I would just evaluate them if you're in that space of like, do we build our own pipelines in Jenkins or do we go and talk to a vendor? Sometimes it's really smart to spend money on these sorts of things. And this is one of those times.
Yeah, yep. And I think that the cost of doing it yourself and building it internally can sometimes get lost just in terms of, you're an employee or a team within an
Yeah.
organization that already pays your salary. So you're not really looking at the true costs of building and then also maintaining this over time, right? Like day one, this stuff, well, I find day one, this stuff tends to look pretty good because you've got all these ideas and you're there, making good
Easy.
progress. But how does that look on sort of day 200 or 300, or that main person, like you said before, leaves the organization, that was writing that piece of, that those pipelines or had strung that all together? Like, where does that then leave everyone else at that point?
That's extremely well said because I think it is that day 200, that day 300 that I think you need the experience of seeing how big of a maintenance burden it actually is to understand how much investment it requires. And yeah, let's, if you even go with round numbers, a US based engineer, software engineer, platform engineer, whatever, working at $100,000, if they're spending 50% of their year building pipelines for 10 teams, that's $50,000 they're spending. And they're building custom code. They're building a custom thing for this organization that needs to be maintained and updated. And yeah, if they leave, somebody else needs to come in and they need to understand all that custom code and they need to still continue to maintain it. And it's just the ROI does not usually match up. Like when we've talked to really large organizations, what I've talked to them and said is, hey, if you want to put 2 full-time people on maintaining pipelines for your organization, they might be able to build something that's, good enough on GitHub Actions, but you're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars there. Like it's smarter for you to adopt the vendor tool that's built today and enforces good practices, gives you the ability to immediately wire in security checks and role-based access control out to wazoo, and gives you a good framework for building around. People don't want to hear that sometimes, but that's the truth. And it's just reality.
Yeah, I mean the vendor ecosystem exists because people, can focus in on their specific area of expertise, right? Like,
Yeah.
if I'm a company building this tooling, like that's what I do well, or that's what I should be focusing on and doing really well, and I should be able to do that better than most internal, teams that are out there at my customers. So that's the way I kind of look at it. The cost is always a big thing, right? Because someone sees an invoice come in for 30, 40, $50,000, whatever the number is, and then they're like, should we just do this ourselves? But I think that's where the evaluation of the true cost of internally building it yourself, it doesn't quite always come out and surface itself in that fair sort of comparison with a lot of the vendor tooling that's available. So
Yeah. Right
yeah,
there. We
cool.
see it the same way. It's funny that we see a lot of things the same way.
Yeah, yep, and we're both Matt, and you've lived in Tassie here for a little bit as well, I found out, so,
Yeah.
yeah.
I traveled around and had a van in Tasmania for a month, and lived out of Hobart, and it was a really good time. I
Yeah,
love that.
yep,
That little island is an amazing place.
it
I'm
is,
jealous,
yeah.
for real.
Yeah, yeah. I always say the older I get, the more I like it here because it's just sort of, laid back and easy, and I can go and travel to different places and see different people and customers, and then I can come back home and, like, sort of breathe again. It's just sort of nice, so, yeah.
Yeah, and you have the lavender fields. There's those totem poles that I never got to that are like down south. I don't
Yeah.
know. There's a bunch of really cool stuff that's on Tassie. I loved Freycinet was like a highlight. That was a really cool park. So
Yeah, yep.
yeah,
Certainly a top
talk about
destination.
Tassie
Yeah.
for a while.
Yeah, yeah. Awesome. All right, Matt, I have really enjoyed this conversation. I hope we can cross paths somewhere at a conference,
Yeah,
in the real world, because it'd be awesome to actually catch up and meet you and talk some of this. I think there's a second episode for sure somewhere in here, so I'd love to get you back.
would love to
Uh,
do it,
s-
Matt. And yeah, it's been a
yeah,
pleasure. Easy to
yep.
chat with you.
Yeah, so thanks so much. I've got one last question for you, just as we wrap up here, and it's a pretty quick one. And for the listeners out there, if there's any is there one key takeaway that you would put in their minds after listening to this conversation, or one action item that they could take away from this?
I said it a few times, so I think this is it. But yeah, don't reinvent the wheel. Like that's shouldn't be your job is to reinvent the wheel. You should go and find the way that people have done it well elsewhere. Use that, whether you need to pay for it or it's open source. Don't reinvent the wheel.
Awesome. I love it. If you want to connect with Matt, I'm sure he'd love to connect with you online. Matt Gowie on LinkedIn. I will include a bunch of links below, both to how you can find Matt and where you can find him, as well as MasterPoint. And of course, a lot of the resources that we talked about here, I'll grab some links off Matt afterwards and make sure that they're in the show notes. So, again, really appreciate your time. That was a really fun conversation. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
This is a great one. Yeah, happy to do it again sometime.